Hello again, Niclas, and welcome on this International Webinar Week on our net zero carbon topic. It's really a pleasure to welcome you today, and thank you, a warm thank you for having accepted our invitation and to contribute to the speech we've had so far. Before giving you the floor for a 30-minute presentation followed by 50 minutes Q&A. Sometimes it goes to 30 minutes and even this morning to 40 minutes, so one never know. Let me present you and the topic of your presentation in a few words. So you are the manager for Global Climate Action and UNFCCC. So UNFCCC means United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You are responsible for different initiatives related to engaging non-party stakeholders like private sectors, civil society, cities, etc. in climate action. You've been working with the United Nations for the past 20 years with different positions and countries. This includes the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, where you first managed the UNEP industry program in Asia Pacific, and later started several global initiatives related to sustainable buildings, urban development, and sustainable procurement. Today, you will present us the role of the building sector in the United Nations climate negotiations, how it will be affected by, and how it can contribute to the implementation of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Niclas, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Frederick, and hello, everybody. It's really a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to share a little bit about what is happening or is not happening about buildings and construction within the climate negotiations. So again, my name is Niclas Svenningsen. I'm working with UNFCCC, as Frederick just mentioned. I'll dive right into the presentation here, and let me just share my screen to that end. So let me just see that this is actually working now. And I'm going to do like, okay. So I hope that you can see this now.
Yeah.
So
perfect,
yes. So let me tell you that I'm actually a civil engineer by training. I have, by different accidents, ended up working in the United Nations, but never really regretted it. And one of the big joys for me is that I also had an opportunity to work on constructions and buildings from the climate and sustainability perspective, which is a very inspiring and interesting issue, actually. So I am working in this organization that is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is basically the organization within the UN system that is leading our climate work. Now, if you're thinking about United Nations, you normally have something like this in mind: big international meetings where governments are meeting each other, working together, trying to work together to solve the problems of the world. And UNFCCC, or just UN Climate Change, as we also like to call ourselves, is actually no different. We have 197 members, or parties as we call them, which are all national governments plus the European Union, which is also a party to the convention. We were started in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And our big goal is really to tackle this climate change challenge that we are all facing. So we have been in business for a little bit more than, well, about 30 years soon. And our main objectives is really to create this framework that will help governments to work together. Now, if you're looking at what we really are dealing with here, it's an issue that we have known about for a very long time. The fact is that already 130 years ago, there was a Swedish scientist called Svante Arrhenius who was able to model fairly exactly what would happen to the global climate if the concentration of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, was increased. So this was just at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And what we have seen happening there is that those predictions, that models has worked very well, unfortunately. Due to the Industrial Revolution, to our increasing use of fossil fuels, due to a number of other activities such as cutting down forests, agriculture, and many other reasons, we have increased our greenhouse gases in the atmosphere considerably. And with that, we have also seen an increase in the average temperatures of the climate around the world. And the fact is that since we started to have recorded measurements of the global temperature on record, we can say that 10 of the hottest years ever on record has happened in the last 13 years. So we know where we're going. The science is consistent with the observations and the data we're having. And we also know that we are still at the beginning of this disaster, and it's not too late to avert the worst effects of it. Now, the UNFCCC itself is a convention. So it's a cooperation mechanism for governments. And the convention itself doesn't really say what needs to be done. It just says parties or countries are committed to work together. So we were trying to get this blueprint for climate action for many years, and we had some early attempts, such as a Kyoto Protocol that started in 2004. But it was only 5 years ago in Paris that we got the Paris Agreement on climate change. And that really is that big international, globally adopted blueprint for how the governments of the world are going to work together. Now, why has it taken so long time to reach that agreement? 30 years, and 5 years later, we are still starting to get it implemented, but we're nowhere where we want to be. Well, the reason is very simple, that this is not only about reducing emission of one or a couple of types of gases. This is about changing the way that we're going about our society, about transports, about buildings, about economic affairs, about energy supply, about consumption, about production, how we build our cities, and so on. So if we're going to be successful with this, we need to look at everything we are doing. And our parties are well aware about that. And it's not an easy nut to crack, let me say. But the good thing is that with climate action comes a lot of benefits. All these areas on how we build our cities, on how we are building our buildings, how we are doing transport, how we generate energy and so on, will actually come with very big benefits if we're able to implement the solutions that we have. Now, as I said, we have 197 parties to UNFCCC. And the way that the Paris Agreement works is that every party, every country have their own climate action plan. It's not top down. It's not the United Nations telling different countries, you have to do like this. We are not the police, but every country are voluntarily saying, these are the things we are going to do, and this is what we hope to achieve. And they are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And that is a horrible name for something that is actually really important to keep in mind. And I'm going to come back to this one here. But basically, what we're trying to achieve with the Paris Agreement and with these 197 NDCs is to take down the emission curve so that we are not having more climate change than maximum 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, ideally closer to 1 to 5 degrees. The less the climate change is, the less the problems will be. And we are not talking about, a polar bear on an iceberg or melting glaciers. We are talking about the fundamental survival of the ecosystems that are so important, not only for the planet, but also for us as a society to function, how we produce our food, how we transport, how we live our lives. Unfortunately, the current projections, if we're looking at the NDCs we have today, is that we're going to hit 3 degrees or more than 3 degrees by the end of this century. And that is only if everything is implemented. And we know that many of these NDCs are conditional. So they say, we're going to do this if other things are happening. So we need more NDCs, we need better NDCs, and I'm coming back to that in a moment. one thing that I want to make very clear is that the NDCs is not an island to itself. It exists within a wider framework on sustainable development. You are probably aware of that. In the same year that the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, containing 17 Sustainable Development Goals, was also adopted. And they all go together. Actually, climate action is one of the goals in the SDG agenda. But climate action and the NDCs is the only globally binding agreement that has a really big political impact, also at national levels. Also related to where we are today is, of course, that we have a pandemic going on. And we know that we need to restart the economies after the pandemic, and we talk about green recovery. And again, that green recovery will have to go together with climate action, because what we don't want to do is to go back to business as usual, because that was putting us in the wrong direction. That was putting it into a much warmer world. We want to have green recovery that is actually really helping us also to adapt to and prepare for climate change. So in a sense, the NDCs is the engine that is driving the train of all the other development goals and priorities. Now, I was told that you have listened to some 30 different speakers. You probably already know this, but I'm going to mention it anyway. And that is, why are buildings important for climate change? Well, buildings are important for climate change for a number of reasons. First of all, about 40% of the primary energy use on our planet is caused directly or indirectly by buildings. And almost a similar share of the global greenhouse gas emissions are also attributable to what is happening in our buildings when they are operated or when they are constructed. In 2019, the total amount of greenhouse gases from the sector was about 10 gigatons. That is 10 billion tons. So that is a lot. The total amount of greenhouse gases today is about 40 billion tons. And when we're looking what's happening, we having a lot of new buildings coming up all the time. Basically, every 25 minutes, the equivalent of Empire State Building is added. Or another way you could say that the new Paris is built every 5 years. So most of the buildings that are going to exist in 30 years from now do actually not exist now. But in addition to that, of course, we need to do something about the existing building stock that we have today. Now, the good news is that with technologies that we have, and with technologies that are commercialized and affordable, we can reduce emissions already by about 70% in most cases. And that most of that is related to energy, so even 80% of energy-related emissions can also be reduced. We're talking about increasing the share of renewable energy sources as one solution, of course, but also improving the energy intensity that we are using our buildings. So having less watt hours per square meter in principle. We have in the last couple of years seen a very increased energy use in the area of cooling, of building cooling, of HVAC system and similar. And that is something there's a lot of potential to reduce that. But right now we're just adding capacity without really looking at efficiency, and that we have to look at also. When we're talking about energy efficiency, also, we're talking about heating, we're talking about lighting, we're talking about appliances and so on, and not least the improvement of the envelope of buildings, on windows, on insulation, on heat pumps, and so on. And then you can look outside the buildings and you see what comes before the building and after building, which of course is the construction of building materials and the recycling of building materials. Cement today is one of the largest sector in itself as industrial sector that is contributing CO2, so one of the most potent greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And we have increased our consumption of cement about 30 times since the 1950s. But on the good side is that there's a lot of potential to actually drive down the climate footprint of cement production. And we're also seeing the same thing happening in steel and other building materials. But something that is also really, really important is to remember that a building is not an island to itself. Every building is connected to energy, to water, waste is taken care of, you have transports, you have roads, you have other buildings, you have local shopping centers and so on. And all that in this turn are in different way influencing the actual energy consumption for the building. Now, so why don't we just implement the solutions? Well, I want actually to go back to UNFCCC before I try to respond to this question. The UNFCCC is maybe best known for the conference of parties that we call it, the big climate meetings that we have every year, except last year because we had to postpone because of the pandemic. But this year in Glasgow in November, we will again bring together all our parties for a couple of weeks to try to move forward the implementation of the Paris Agreement. If you go into those COPs, you will not hear anybody talking about buildings, but you will also not hear anybody talking about energy, about transport, about agriculture, about water, about cities, about anything like this. I was working with United Nations Environment Program, and I was running an initiative we called Sustainable Buildings and Construction Initiative some 10, 15 years ago. And when I went to the first COP, to the first conference of the parties on the UNFCCC, I had this idea that they were going to talk about buildings because that is where the solutions are. But our parties are not really talking about solutions. They are talking about how they can work together at the political level, how they can report, how they can monitor what is happening, how they can review that everybody are doing what they can, and how they can generate the funding and the capacity that is needed. But they don't speak about specific solutions or specific sectors. So that was a disappointment for me when I came there. And we are now slowly starting to talk about solutions. But so far, very little has been said at the COP. And the fact is that if you want to achieve changes, you need actually to look at the NDCs. And I'm going back to that in a moment. But why don't we just implement solutions? Well, there are three drivers in the building sector in general. It is what the construction sector can do and what they're aware that they need to do. It is about what the consumers, the buyers and the renters and the users of building, what they want and what they care about. If they care about the climate, if they care about the energy bill, for example. And then, of course, what governments is telling us that we have to do. And this is really, really impactful. So the enablers that we are seeing at work today, it's first of all, the public awareness and education. And we are seeing more and more people, especially with the new generations coming up, really, really understanding climate change in a way that I would say my own generation has not in general been able to do. And this is good news. So the education and awareness is increasing, but in order to be able to take action when you're buying a house or you're renting a house, you also need to have some kind of an energy rating of the thing you're buying. If you think about it, if you buy a liter of milk, you will know exactly what is included in it. If you buy a house or if you rent a house, you will struggle to understand what is the energy footprint or the energy declaration of that house. The second part is legislation and standards. And here, energy performance of buildings and energy standards for the performance of buildings is really important, as well as ambitious refurbishment programs. Renovations of the existing building stock is important, especially those of you who are living in Paris, because I used to live there myself, will know that there's lots to do often in old buildings to really make them, energy efficient. And finally, financing. Money talks always. And according to the International Energy Agency, in order to implement a number of the measures that need to be implemented to make buildings sustainable and energy efficient, we need to add about $270 billion. And that sounds a lot per year. Now, that sounds a lot until you realize that $4.9 trillion is what is normally spent on buildings and construction. So we're talking about 5%, increasing the investment by about 5%. So financing is not a barrier. It should not be a barrier. But in some countries, of course, this is an issue. But more and so, it is about what the construction sector can and know and what the consumers are asking for. So just to give you one example of what it looks like globally today, which is building energy codes, which is one of the key measures that we need to implement to achieve more energy efficient, sustainable buildings. You will find that some countries have mandatory energy codes for all building stock. Some have it for a couple, but actually a majority, and especially in the parts of the world where we'll see most of the new buildings coming up in the next 30 years, they actually don't have those building energy codes. So much more needs to be done here. Now, let's go back to UNFCCC and the international negotiations. I said that our negotiators are not talking about buildings, and unfortunately this is true, but I think they will talk about buildings in the next couple of years. Because 5 years ago we didn't have NDCs, today we have the NDCs. And just to reiterate again, these are the national action plans by governments that are saying this is what we're going to do to contribute to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Science tells us that if we're going to implement the Paris Agreement, we need to reduce global emissions also in the building sector by 50% in the next 10 years. Think about that, reducing the global emissions by 50% in the next 10 years. We shouldn't have to have that task in front of us, but the fact is that we have lost the last 10, 20 years on people questioning about climate change if it's real, and not being fully committed to actually get the Paris Agreement approved. We have today 191 parties who have already submitted the NDCs. And as I mentioned, altogether, they will bring us to a 3-degree world by 2100, which is not acceptable. It's not what we want. Now, the good news is that every 5 years, our parties have to update their NDCs. And in between these every 5 years, we'll also have something we call the global stocktake, where parties are going to review each other's NDCs to try to find opportunities to work together and increase ambition. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle where we increase ambition every 5 years and we're getting more and more actions into the NDCs. Now, if you look at the building sector in the NDCs, out of the 191 NDCs, 104 are mentioning actions that are in different ways related to energy efficiency in buildings or emission reduction in buildings. It's very much looking on the operational energy, so the running, the heating, the cooling, the powering of houses. It's very limited when it comes to the embodied carbon, so what we have in the building and construction materials. The type of measures that are mentioned in NDCs is mainly policies, which is maybe natural because these are action plans by governments. There are parts of technologies that will be implemented or introduced, education and training, mostly of the actors in the building sector. In some cases, you just put targets. You don't really know how you're going to implement it, but the targets are there. And they are looking on leadership and finance incentives and research. Very few of these targets are actually saying we're going to have a carbon neutral sector, which we know is technically possible in many, many cases. But also in general, the reference to the building sectors in these NDCs are very generic. But it's not only so for the building sector, it's so for all sectors, because we are still with the first generation of NDCs. The first generation of NDCs basically come from 2015. They were put together according to no particular formats, and this format is being elaborated almost like a learning by doing approach here. But the overarching challenge here is really to ensure that not 104 countries have buildings in the NDCs, but that every country have buildings and very specific and ambitious targets included in the NDCs. Because if we do that, then we are going to be able to see the NDCs driving change in the building sector. Now, these are just a couple of examples of how buildings are referred to in NDCs. I have opted not to go with European Union or some Japan or Australia, which have rather elaborate NDCs, but more sort of an average NDCs type of NDCs that you will see. So in Cameroon, in Africa, for example, they have decided to revise the building codes to improve energy performance by thermal standards of construction and renovation. And one way they're going to do that is to train and organize the entire value chain toward low consumption construction. In Tunisia, they have put up a target to decrease primary energy demand by 30% compared to 2010. including renewable energy in the building sector. And they recognize that their indices are going to generate 58,000 new jobs, 75% of which will happen in the building sector. So that is a good incentive and a good way of bringing enthusiasm and support for this kind of action. In Senegal, they have said that it will pass regulation that requiring companies to carry out energy audits and energy supply studies and to improve performance of building energy performance from 5 to 15%, which may not be very important, but think of that they're actually starting from zero. There's nothing happening there until now. So it's a good first step. In Mexico, they are aware of that they are going to double their greenhouse gas emissions quite a lot if they're not taking action there. So they're encouraging construction of sustainable buildings towards energy efficient and low carbon footprint and sustainable buildings. And they're also promoting the residential use of solar panels and heaters. And then finally, Mongolia, as an example, they are committed to reduce energy heat loss by 20% by 2020 compared to 2014 levels. And that is much also to be done by improved insulation. So you would maybe say, after having heard now other speakers in this course saying that that is all good. It's not super detailed. It's not, very, very ambitious always, but it's something. And that is exactly what it is. It is something, but the potential for improving this drastically in the next generation of NDCs is very, very big. Now, here's the thing also. So the NDCs are by governments. But the NDCs, the governmental actions, are also matched by non-party stakeholder commitments. And my part of the UNFCCC Secretariat, our job is really to try to support and catalyze climate action in what we call non-party stakeholders. So that is everybody who's not a negotiator. It's in the private sector, in civil society, and in sub-national authorities, cities. And we are keeping track of the commitments that these non-party stakeholders are doing. And if you're looking at the number of commitments you have in this graph, you will see that the NDCs, the public sector here, the blue on the left, it's only about 10% of commitments made. And then the private sector has another 10%. But then the big movement is really happening in cities. Cities are getting to grips with this. Cities realize that they're going to be some of the first victims to ramping climate change. So they also understand that this is something that they need to deal with. Now, I said that our negotiators are not talking about buildings, but the fact is that we have introduced a new part of our climate process and UNFCCC process that we call the Global Climate Action Agenda. And through that agenda, we are bringing in big coalitions of non-party stakeholders to present to our negotiators and try to inspire them in a different way about what can be done in different sectors that will help the government's work with implementing ambitious NDCs. And this is something we just started recently. It's starting to get traction. We have developed specific pathways, climate action pathways for different sectors. For example, we have one pathway that is for human settlements, which includes both construction and buildings and city planning. And these climate action pathways, which you can find if you go into our website, unfccc.int, are of course at the global level. And to be really useful, they need to be brought down to the national level. But I do want to give a shout out to the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, the Global ABC Initiative, which is run by the United Nations Environment Programme, based in Paris, that particular initiative. And they have developed, actually, they are the lead organizations in terms of developing this pathway. And let me, as the last slide here, just give you a taste of what are the specific measures that they have identified needs to happen. Well, first of all, urban planning, of course. We see still a very rapid expansion of new urban centers. And those centers are looking on the logistics, if you like, of cities, but they often forget that how you build a city and how you plan a city will have an enormous impact on the energy performance of the city and of the buildings. Think of, for example, Hong Kong, which is a high density, very, very integrated city and take almost any big city in North America, I don't know, Austin or Seattle or something, where it's very spread out and you really need to transport yourself, and the only way you can transport yourself is by your own car to go to the work, to different service centers, or to do shopping. New buildings is of course a focus, and having high efficiency standards on energy is a key recommendation here. And when it comes to existing buildings, and I was just seeing a presentation by another colleague from IISB about the amount of existing buildings as compared to the number of new buildings that are added every year. And it's clear that even though majority of buildings that we'll have 30 years from now have not yet been built, a very large majority of buildings that we'll have in the next couple of years are already there. And they are usually not built with a very high efficiency. So we need also to accelerate retrofitting and renovation of the existing building stocks. Building operations, of course, is important. How do we manage our buildings? How do we make sure that we don't have any energy thieves? Appliances and systems, either the ones that are built into the buildings or are plugged in, can also have a huge impact on the climate footprint of buildings. The materials, I mentioned this earlier, cement and steel, but bricks and mortar and everything else that we're using also comes with the climate footprints. But the good news is that that sector is offering more sustainable alternatives. The trick now is actually to make them used, to make sure that they're being used when we're building new buildings. Buildings are not only a culprit, if you like, in the climate equation, they're also victims. Today, a majority of the built environment is actually in risk zones for extreme weather events, because the majority of the buildings today are in coastal zones, and coastal zones are by definition becoming risk zones from the climate change perspective. And finally, but certainly not least, we need to shift over to clean energy. This is something that is happening, not fast enough though, and shifting over to clean energy does not only mean that we adapt to clean energy, but we also need to phase out the business as usual models on coal, on oil, on gas, and other forms of fossil fuels. So that brings me to the end here. And what my main message here really is that if you look at buildings and climate negotiations, buildings are tremendously important because they have a very large part, they represent a very large part of the potential solution to the climate change problem. Still, they are not really being discussed or mentioned at the global level in UNFCCC, although we see this is coming. But if we really, really want to influence the global climate action agenda, we need to focus on the role of buildings in the national determined contributions, in the national action plans. And that does not happen at COP. It happens at the national level, at the local level, before and after the COP, but not during the COP, because during COP, people don't have time to listen to each other. Everybody are talking. But really, I think there is a huge potential. And I'm glad to be in the position I am, where I can see and follow, and to some extent also support this agenda. So I will stop there. I'm saying thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.